let's get started. Tonight we're going to talk about the sensory classroom. And so I've done quite a few talks now for Twinkl, and this, parts of them are always going to overlap. So some of you may have heard parts of what I'm about to say before. So let's get started. In case you don't know me, just a very, very quick introduction. So my name's Kathy Wassell and I run Autistic Girls Network charity, which is a very tiny charity that supports autistic girls and women and their families and campaigns for earlier diagnosis, because girls are diagnosed on average 6 years later than boys. I've got 2 autistic young people of my own, autistic and otherwise neurodivergent, and I am neurodivergent myself. I also have written a book called Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person. I have a master's in autism and I've just started a PhD, and my PhD is actually on something which I've got a slide for in a couple of slides, I think. It's on a checklist about an internal profile of autism, which is part of our white paper that I'll show you in a minute. I also have family involvement with CAMS, with intensive support team, social care, EHCPs, flex learning and specialist schools. So any questions around any of those are perfectly okay. I am going to leave time for questions at the end. Again, you may have heard me say this before, just going to tell you why I don't use the term ASD, because obviously that is what's in the diagnostic manual and it's what you will get probably what it will say in your assessment letter for you or for your child. ASD obviously stands for autism spectrum disorder. It's the D word that I don't like. Autistic people are not disordered. Autism is not a disorder, nor is it a mental health disorder, which is actually what the diagnostic manual is. So there's an awful lot to unpick there, and I'm not going to unpick it all now, but just autistic or autism is what we use as a charity. We also use identity first language, so we say autistic person rather than person with autism, and there's a lot of reasons for that. The main one is that there have been lots of polls now among autistic people asking them which they prefer, and the runaway choice is always autistic person. Also, person with autism sounds like it's a bit like either an illness or it's like a handbag that you can pick up and put down, neither of which are true. If you're autistic, you've always been autistic since the moment that you were born. It's part of you. It's not the whole of you. It's not your whole identity, but it's part of your identity. And it affects the way that you see things. It affects the way that you experience the world, and it can't be extracted from you. So that's why I use those terms. I always say anyone can use any terms they like, but I'm explaining why I'm using those terms. So this is the white paper that I just mentioned. I'm doing my PhD on the checklist that's inside it. It's the pages in pink if you ever get to see it. It's free to download on our website. You can buy a printed copy, but we have to charge for those because they cost us quite a lot to print. But it's freely downloadable on our website. And it talks about not just about girls, but about an internal profile and how that's different to an external profile, which is more like the classic kind of autism that everyone thinks that they know. So if you want to learn more about an internal profile, then go and have a look at that. But today we're going to be talking about sensory stuff. And there is a lot to unpack in this topic. But we're going to be talking about things like really getting to know pupils or your child, depending on whether you're a teacher or a parent or a teaching assistant. Whatever they have difficulty with, whatever their strengths are, putting support in place to give them autonomy is the most important thing that you can do. So all the next slides are going to be about sensory stuff, which will lead into emotional regulation, because they're so connected that I couldn't not have them in this webinar. But the most important thing is enabling autonomy. So I just wanted to get that slide in there to really emphasize that. So let's talk about our senses. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, we actually have 8 senses, and we're going to talk about, well, we're going to touch on all of them tonight. And if you know a lot about this subject, then they'll already be familiar with you. If you don't know so much about it, then the last 3 ones might seem quite new. So anyway, let's go through them. Obviously, there's what we can see, as long as you aren't vision impaired, of course. And as far as the sensory sensitivities go, we could be talking about things like visual clutter. We could be talking about being too bright. We could be talking about loving brightness. You know, it really is that individual, and it really is everyone. It really is that different. So when you're talking about being in the classroom, then examples of visual overwhelm might be sitting where the sunshine is bright through the window and it's in your eyes and you need to put the blind down or something like that. Examples of visual kind of sensory seeking might be, and again, this is going to be different for every single person, but might be things like seeking out things in your favorite color, you know, being attracted to certain patterns, if there's patterns on the wall, for example, being attracted to particular favorite things like pictures of cats or, you know, anything like that. So it's very, very individual. And then if we look at auditory, obviously this is things that you can hear. So for a lot of people, the immediate thing that they will think of when thinking about this in terms of sensory sensitivity is things being too loud. And definitely that has a huge impact. There is something called misophonia, which is basically being unable to deal with everyday sounds. So things like someone chewing next to you, or might not even be next to you, might be quite far away from you, but you can still hear it. Things like that can be unbearable. Things like the electricity light switches making a noise. I can hear electricity in light switches, and sometimes it's really overwhelming. Things like clocks ticking. I think a lot of people have a problem with clocks ticking. Things like somebody clicking their pen. My daughter started university in September, and a text I got on the first day that she was there said, "I'm next to a pen clicker." And that was it. That person was forever classified as a pen clicker. I don't know if she's ever seen them again, but she probably never wants to, because they're a pen clicker. And of course, that's different if it's you clicking the pen. If your stim is clicking a pen, then you're not even going to really notice that it's happening. But if it's somebody else doing it, and it's not something that you know, want to listen to, then it's going to be a problem. And then we move on to, I never know how to pronounce this, so please forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, gustatory, which is taste. So taste things. And of course, that's all bound up with food, which can have its own issues for autistic people anyway. A lot of autistic people have some kind of restricted eating, you know, in varying in huge amounts. And I'm not necessarily talking about eating disorders, although eating disorders are more common in an autistic population. But just generally having restrictions on what you will eat and what you will eat next to other things, next to other kinds of food, or whether you'll have a sauce on something, for example. And of course, that's all bound up with the taste of scent. The sense of taste. They're all bound together. You can't really extract them from each other. But there are going to be sensory issues with taste. And it's going to be not just about the flavor of things, but also the texture of things. And so what often works, if there is restricted eating, and if you do want to get your child, for example, to eat something else, although it works with adults as well, food chaining can be a good thing to do. So, for example, if they like, let me think of something, Ritz crackers, for example, they're salty, they're cheesy, they're crisp, well, to a certain extent, they're crispy. And so what you would do if you were food chaining is you would find something else that had some of those attractions to it. So you would think about something else that's really salty, that has a similar texture to a Ritz cracker, and you would try with that. So those are the first three. And then we've got olfactory, which is smell. And again, this is something that's very, very personal, I think. I can't stand perfume or, you know, aftershave or any of that. It actually makes me sneeze. It really, I find it really unattractive. I can't sit next to somebody who's wearing strong perfume or aftershave. I have difficulty being in a lift with somebody. I can smell it for ages afterwards. I really don't like it. And so that is something to think about if you have young people with strong senses of smell or very sensitive senses of smell in the classroom, and you are wearing perfume or you are wearing aftershave or, you know, anything that smells. It is something to think about. They may find it very difficult to deal with. But of course, there's lots of other things to think about. Are they near the dining hall, for example? Can they smell the school dinners being cooked? Can they smell other things? You know, do they have packed lunches and the person sitting next to them, or even the person 3 tables away, has an egg mayonnaise sandwich that really smells, for example? Is it, if it's secondary school, are they near the science labs? Is there smells, you know, for experiments and things? Can they smell different chemicals? Often when radiators are on hot, they produce a smell as well. Can they smell that? There's lots of things, aren't there, all around the school probably, that have a peculiar smell. Those could be no-go areas for that young person if they have a really strong sense of smell. For some of them, there will be individual smells that may, for example, make them feel sick or something like that. So this is just one of the many examples that we'll talk about tonight, where you have to get to know your student or your child, and you have to get to know their individual profile. And, you know, you have to understand those things. Do they really hate perfume? Do they feel sick at the smell of egg mayonnaise, for example? Those are important things to find out. And then moving on to touch, tactile. Can they stand being touched? Not everyone can. Do they like hugs? Are they a sensory seeker? Do they like deep pressure? And we'll go into that more in the next 3 senses. All of those things, again, very individual. But for somebody who doesn't like to be touched, or really, you know, can't stand to be touched, walking down the corridors, for example, in a secondary school at changeover class time, that's like the corridors of hell. It's like navigating the corridors of hell, because you cannot avoid being touched. Likewise, in PE classes, you often can't avoid being touched, you know, or having people bump into you, or, for example, showing that you don't like being touched can also make you quite vulnerable to bullying as well, because then some young people will deliberately try to touch you to get a rise out of you. All of those things are quite difficult to deal with. But then let's move on to the 3 that are perhaps a little bit less well known. So first of all, we have interoception, which is a really important sense. I would urge you, if you don't know much about it, I would urge you to go and find out more after this, or tomorrow, or next week, not necessarily after this at 8 o'clock at night. But interoception is how we feel things in our body. So, for example, feeling things in our tummy. What do we feel in our tummy? Well, there's a range of things, aren't there, that we feel there. We feel like we're hungry. We feel it there. We feel like we need to go to the toilet. Either we need to go urgently, or we have an upset stomach. Perhaps we feel poorly. We feel emotions in our stomach. We feel excited. We talk about butterflies in the stomach. We feel scared sometimes in our tummies. And those are emotions. They're not physical sensations, but we still feel them physically in our tummy. And if you can feel those and identify those well, then you have a good sense of interoception, and the nerve signals are getting through to your brain. Your body is sending the right signals to your brain, and you're able to identify those. But if your sense of if your interoceptive system is not working so well, then those signals aren't getting through to your brain, and you can't necessarily identify what's going on. So although you'll be able to feel something, your body is not telling you that you feel hungry, for example, or it's telling you that you always feel hungry. Or it's not telling you that you need the toilet, or it's not telling you that you're thirsty and you need to have a drink. So all of those things are obviously not conducive to looking after yourself. They're not conducive to your well-being. And if you realize that a child that's in your care has poor interoception, then you need to start thinking about how you can put strategies in place, depending on their age, of course. If they're older, they may have already put their own strategies in place. But you need to start thinking about strategies of how you can help with that. So if they can't tell that they are thirsty, then you can do things like have a marked water bottle so they can see how much they're drinking. You can suggest, and again, this is going to depend whether they're demand avoidant or not, but you can suggest, you know, you need to finish this water bottle by the end of the day. Don't say that if they're demand avoidant. You can put other strategies in place. If your child always wears a coat, regardless of how hot it is in the summer, I'm sure that some of us have that child or know that child, then it's possible that they can't tell that they're really hot until they're, you know, until they're so hot that they actually feel ill about it. Or again, they might not be able to tell that they're really cold. They might wear shorts all year round. There's lots of that going on, and it will be, you know, you will have children in your school that you'll recognize from that, and it's probably because their interoception is not so great. Then let's move on to proprioception. Now, proprioception is all about how you can identify where your body is in space, if you like. I don't mean deep space. I mean where you are. Can you identify with your eyes closed that you've raised up your arms and your hands are waving in the air? Things like that. For some people who, again, with their signals are not getting through to the brain properly, they can't do that. And so, for example, they may need to look at their feet when they walk or something like that. They may have difficulty, you know, playing netball or something like that because they can't figure out where their body is going to be if they move forward at a certain speed. So in that sense, proprioception brings a lot of sensory seeking for it, and you can help children who sensory seek in this way by, again, doing deep pressure or something. So they may like really strong hugs. That may give them a really good sense of feeling where their body is. They may like to swing, for example. They may like to carry heavy bags. You may be able to give them a task in the classroom, which is carrying something. I mean, I don't mean stupidly heavy, but carrying something mildly heavy across the classroom or to the receptionist, or, you know, whatever it might be. All of those things would be good for their own sense of proprioception. And then talking about vestibular movement, this is going to be things like, for example, going for a drive. So vestibular is when you can feel the movement in your tummy and it settles you. So, for example, my daughter, if she's feeling anxious, and for a long time, years in fact, we had to take her for a drive every night without fail, all through COVID, all through lockdown. We had a letter in our car from her consultant to say, in case we got stopped by the police, to say that she had to go for a drive every night. Now her anxiety is a bit less. She doesn't have to so much. Everything is always linked to anxiety. But going for a drive really settles her, really calms her down, really makes her feel less anxious, puts her in a good position where she might be able to go to sleep and she won't fight it so much. So obviously you cannot go for a drive at school, but you can at home, and you can go for a drive in the evening. Maybe, of course, that's going to depend on individual circumstances. If you're a single parent and you've got 4 kids, going for a drive with one of them is going to be impossible, and going for a drive with all of them might not be as calming as you'd like it to be. But we do what we can manage, don't we? So we find ways to make things work. Other things that you could do for vestibular movement is things like swinging, moving around on a roundabout, if that's what they call them these days, moving on a seesaw, all those kind of things are going to be talking about vestibular movement. So let's move on from talking about these and actually get to some nitty-gritty stuff. So let's think about what things we really love and what things are horrible for us, what things make us anxious, make us react in a strong way, in a strong sensory way. Let's think about our glimmers and our triggers. So glimmers are those things which make us happy, which bring us joy. Might be something as simple as a tree of autumn leaves, or seeing your best friend, or hearing one of your favorite songs. Totally different for every person, although there's going to be a lot of overlap. A lot of people like autumn leaves, a lot of people like hearing their favorite song, but what I mean is it needs to be talked about with the young person, and they need total input into this, and they may not have necessarily identified them, so it might take some time to figure out what their glimmers are. Some, I haven't got them on these slides, but somewhere we have some, they'll be on our social media posts. We have some pictures of glimmers, and there's all kinds of different things. It might be something that you really love, like you might like different kinds of fungi, for example. Probably not if you're 7, but you never know. You might like Thomas the Tank Engine, and you might have favorite trains, and seeing a picture of that favorite train might be a glimmer for you. You might like Taylor Swift, and a particular song by Taylor Swift is like your favorite thing and will immediately cheer you up if you hear it. What can be good to do is identify some of those glimmers, more than one, and certainly a few that are possible at school. And you can have them in your bag. They could be part of a sensory toolkit. It could be a smell. It doesn't have to be an actual physical thing. It could be a smell. So, for example, my daughter loved the smell, and we only found this out from a sensory OT assessment, occupational therapy assessment. She loved the smell of freshly washing. I guess it's the washing powder. But she loved that smell, and it could be recreated with Yankee Candle's cotton fresh, that flavor, that smell. And you can get them in little mini packs, mini candles, or you can get them in like car air freshener type things. And she would have it in a plastic bag in her school bag, and when she needed to, she could just have a quick sniff. And for her, that was a glimmer. It was a nice smell that she had. So for that was one of her glimmers. And glimmers are important to counteract the negative effect of our triggers. So for many autistic people, their main triggers are going to be sensory. Very individual again, but it might be the noise or the smell in the dinner hall, might be the texture of a certain food or the sound of someone chewing. My daughter can't sit at the table and listen to anybody. She has to eat separately. Well, none of us eat at the table anymore. Life's too short for that. It could be the rubbing of a clothes label. Could be the feeling of a tight school collar and tie. The list is endless. It could be anything. But what's important is identifying them for each individual, because everyone's different. And when a sensory trigger is too strong, that person might not be able to focus on anything else. hence the need for reasonable adjustments at school and in the workplace indeed. If a tight collar or the seams in regulation school tights, for example, are causing such distress that no learning can take place, it just makes sense to remove the trigger. And obviously, we need to remove as many triggers as we can, but it won't always be possible to remove a trigger. If a trigger is something that's an intrinsic part of the school day for everybody else, then it might not be. I mean, I would always ask about it and I would always advocate for removing the trigger. But if it's not possible, then making sure that you've got some glimmers to counteract it a bit might help. So let's move to the next slide. Why do we need a sensory friendly space? I'm hoping that this is really obvious, so I'm going to keep it very short. But lots of autistic people, a busy or a noisy or a smelly environment with bright lights or too much stimuli can be a nightmare, and it can cause huge overwhelm. A sensory friendly space can reduce stress and overwhelm and allow all of us to be more comfortable. And who doesn't want to be more comfortable? But, you know, from a professional point of view, we should be wanting everyone to be comfortable, because learning can't take place if you're uncomfortable. And for a lot of autistic people, we're not talking just about a level of uncomfortability. We're talking about distress. We're talking about possible pain. You know, labels can cause actual pain, actual physical pain. And so expecting somebody to just put up with it and still learn and still listen and still focus and still take notes and all of that is just not possible. So we need to remove those triggers and make sensory friendly spaces. So how do we do that? What can we change in the classroom? We can change fluorescent lights, for example. And I know that there's a cost to this, and I say it with that knowledge. But fluorescent lights are harsh. They can be physically painful, or they can be just uncomfortable in terms of brightness and noise. They make a noise which can make it impossible to concentrate, and they flicker and they're just not nice. Natural or dimmed light works well, but some kind of flexibility is always good. And then let's think about noise. Open plan is a disaster waiting to happen, whether it's in school, whether it's in home, whether it's in the workplace. If you've got lots of people living in the same space, all talking over each other, all, you know, looking at different screens, all clicking their pens, and all of those things, there is going to be trouble. Not least because in school, you've got lots of people. In the home, if you've got one autistic child, you've probably got another. And so they might have different glimmers and different triggers to each other, which is a whole other webinar. But it's going to mean open plan is difficult for them. And so they might need their own space, which of course, I also say with the knowledge that that may not be possible for everybody. And then let's think about visual overwhelm. This is a visualization of my desk at the moment. It pretty much looks like that, unfortunately. But everyone's different. The ADHD part of my brain fights with the autistic part of my brain. The autistic part of my brain wants clear surfaces and calm and complete A+ organization. The ADHD part of my brain wants to do all the things all the time, and it looks like that, unfortunately. And I think the ADHD part of my brain is winning at the moment on my desk. But everyone is different. Some autistic people can be really, really overwhelmed by visual clutter to the point where it affects how well they're able to process things in that environment. Oddly enough, my household is completely neurodivergent. And my husband is, I don't think he's ADHD. He's autistic, but I don't think he's ADHD. But he's terribly messy. He's terribly messy, but he can't deal with clutter. That's not a good combination, really, is it? So it's a difficult thing in a neurodivergent household, finding a balance and having the spoons, having the energy to clean, for example, and tidy. Those things can be difficult, especially when you're busy. But it's like having a constant distraction if you have visual clutter. Not necessarily this kind of visual clutter. I'm not necessarily talking about piles of stuff and untidiness, but, you know, lots of things on the wall to distract you, lots of patterns to distract you. You may be unable to filter out any of that visual information. So you may be able to you may not be able to focus on what's happening in the classroom. So aiming for calm and simple in classrooms can make processing easier. But that doesn't necessarily mean bare, stark walls. You need to find a happy medium. And some people are going to really benefit from, for example, warm, bright colours. Just perhaps not too many of them. And then there's crowds and too many bodies. And, you know, depending on the size of the school, this may be a problem that is unsolvable, quite frankly. It's more of an issue in corridors and dinner halls and assemblies. But an autistic person is unlikely to welcome being in a situation where they need to be in close proximity with lots of people who aren't their close friends or family. So the more people there are, the more this discomfort can be magnified. People are unpredictable. You can't tell what they're going to do. Uncertainty equals anxiety for an autistic person. And statistics for bullying in schools are bad enough that it is a realistic worry for any student who is a little bit different. And again, that is a whole other webinar in itself. But school staff certainly need to be very, very aware that autistic pupils are likely to be bullied. The statistics are that the majority of autistic pupils are bullied. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on. And then a brief little talk about puberty. For some reason, I love this illustration. I think it's the rebel in me. So the early years of starting periods can be difficult for everybody, but particularly stressful for somebody with strong sensory sensitivities. And combine that with hormones buzzing around our body and different ways of experiencing pain as a neurodivergent person, this can be a really difficult time of the month, which can exacerbate all kinds of other experiences at the same time. Basically, at this time, if you are in pain, if you are in sensory overwhelm, you might not be able to do anything else. You might not be able to concentrate on anything else. But so why are periods difficult? Well, they're painful, or they can be. They're messy. And that may feel like more than some can cope with. And depending on how they're dealt with, there can be even more sensory issues with pads or tampons, as well as executive functioning issues when they need changing and keeping up with how often they need changing. That may be too much. That may be too much to expect. The most popular choice in our Facebook group is to use period pants, as good versions are very absorbent and they don't need changing so often, but there may be sensory issues and they are expensive. Some are cheaper than others. And you can get them in Primark, for example. I'm not sure if they're the cheapest, but they're certainly among the cheapest. But it's whether your child will accept them because they can feel weird, and again, that's a sensory issue. Some opt out of periods with the pill. And obviously, I have no advice to give you on that. I am not a medical professional, but depending on the age of the child, GPs aren't always on board with this. And of course, like all medications, there may be side effects, and it's certainly something that anyone should look into if they're considering it. All of this may feel all-encompassing, and they may be unable to focus on anything else at the time. And if they are hyposensitive to pain, then that may not be an issue for them. But if they're hypersensitive to pain, that also may make other focus impossible, and certainly will, they will need pain relief. They may have to stay off school. I remember staying off school regularly, I think monthly, because I couldn't have done anything if I was at school. I was in too much pain. There is a high incidence of PMDD as well in neurodivergent people, and possibly, I mean, I think there's research looking into it, but possibly looking into other conditions such as endometriosis as well, and whether there's a higher occurrence in neurodivergent people. So thinking of, something to think about anyone in your class that is having their period and is neurodivergent. They may have these extra things to deal with. And everyone is going to cope differently day to day, depending on what's going on around you. You might be feeling ill, you might have your period, you might feel unsafe, or you might feel uncomfortable, or you're with somebody that you don't really know, or you might feel hungry or hangry, you might feel tired, you might feel anxious. All of those things are going to change our body's reactions, and almost exclusively, I have found, ramp up sensory sensitivity. So if your child or your children in your class are going through a big transition, maybe it's the end of year 6 and they're thinking about having to move up to secondary school, for example, although this anxiety can be in much smaller transitions than that as well, then they may be really hyper anxious, and you may suddenly find that things that they used to be able to cope with, such as noises, such as people chewing, for example, things that they never really mentioned before, suddenly are really affecting them, and they can't deal with it, and they're losing their temper, and they are becoming overwhelmed really quickly. And that's probably because they're highly anxious, and it's ramping up everything else for them. You may also find, if your child is ADHD, autistic and ADHD, and they start ADHD meds, you may find that there is a sensory reaction. Not in everybody, and again, it's different in everybody, but we hear quite a lot that I suppose it's quietening down the brain with the ADHD meds, kind of leaves space in the brain for more reaction, for more realizing what's going on, which kind of got shoved under with the chaos of your ADHD brain usually. And you may find that that ramps up sensory reactions too. When my daughter started ADHD meds, it was almost unbearable for her, but for everybody else as well, because it gave her misophonia. So it started off the whole noise thing and being unable to cope with noise thing, and really that's never gone away. She stopped them very quickly, but it's never really gone away. So it can cause those kind of issues. I do apologize if you can hear my dog snoring, by the way. She's very loud. Hopefully you can't. It also means if that's going to ramp up sensory activity, it means that we may be able to cope with a situation or an exercise one day, but not be able to cope with exactly the same thing another day. And this is perfectly reasonable, and it's not something to be used against that young person. We do hear about this quite a lot in the Facebook group. A parent or a teacher, could be either, saying, oh, you could do that yesterday, why can't you do it now? Well, that's why, because they're more anxious now and they can't cope with it, and their sensory reaction is different, and it means that they are having a different level of overwhelm to how they were yesterday, and so that's why they can't cope with it today. What can help is if we can recognize what zone we're in, and how likely we are able to cope in that zone. So are we in the coping zone? Are we in the going into overwhelm zone? Are we in the completely overwhelmed zone? If we can start to be able to recognize that in ourselves, then we're going to be able to put strategies in place. But we may need help to recognize that. So let's think about nurturing those senses. If we think again about those 8 senses, each sense can have its own glimmers and triggers. You can have a favorite sound, you can have a favorite smell, you can have a favorite visual color, for example. And some noises might be triggering but a piece of favorite music is a glimmer. Different for everybody. But for interoception and proprioception and vestibular senses, we need to consider their importance. So we've already talked about being a sensory seeker, and indulging those senses that we seek can give a particular comfort, or it can ease a particular discomfort. So we've talked about a vestibular sensory seeker finding relief in going for a drive. Usually it usually is at night. I was going to say at night, of course it can be any time of the day, but I think evening is often a time when anxiety is ramped up, and it's probably to do with different levels of melatonin in our bodies, but also that kind of preparation for that transition of being awake to going to sleep, that transition of being downstairs with people to going upstairs to your room, being on your own, lying in bed, not being able to get to sleep, and your brain working overtime and perhaps thinking quite intrusive thoughts. And that is going to make somebody anxious. And so that's why often evening is a good time to go for a drive or to do any of those things which give relief. So a proprioceptive sensory seeker can benefit from being given something heavy to carry. Deep pressure, swinging, fidgeting, all of those things can bring relief and fend off overwhelm. So it's important to know your autistic students well so that you can work with them to formulate sensory plans which can regulate their whole day. And it really can make a lot of difference to them in school. But everyone needs to be on board. However careful and detailed your plan, trust is going to be destroyed if there's one teacher who tells them they can't use their fidget toy, for example. And then let's think about helping self-regulation. If a child doesn't fully recognize their glimmers and triggers and is unable to recognize the build up to being overwhelmed, they're not going to be able to regulate their emotions well. And there's a whole other side to this if we're talking about alexithymia, which is being unable to or having difficulty recognizing and describing emotions. And it often goes hand in hand with poor interoception. Over half of autistic people are alexithymic, but we could do a whole webinar about alexithymia. So I'm not gonna talk more about this, apart from to say, if you think this is your child, then it would benefit you to find out more about it. So if they can't regulate their emotions well, that's going to manifest in distressed behavior because it's got to come out, and nobody has noticed the build-up of emotion or helped them to disperse it. So all young people need to learn through co-regulation with adults. But for those with poor interoception, this is going to be particularly important. So whatever caused a meltdown, for example, or complete overwhelm, it might just be the straw that broke the camel's back. It's not necessarily that thing that is the really bad thing. It might be a build-up of all those things, and that was the last thing which pushed them over the edge. It's unlikely to be what's actually wrong, and so hence you get what seems like a disproportionate reaction. It's not a disproportionate reaction because it's the sum of all those things that were wrong and that caused sensory discomfort. But it seems like that at the time. And these young people require assistance to help them recognize some emotions and recognize the build-up of them so that they can put agreed strategies in place before they reach overwhelm. And this might need the help of an occupational therapist or perhaps a speech and language therapist, but it can also be helped by adults they trust narrating their own emotions. So, for example, you can say, oh, so-and-so happened today. That made me really happy. And happy is an easy emotion to start with. Most people, even if they're alexithymic, can recognize happy because it's an early developmental emotion that we start figuring out when we're toddlers. The more complicated emotions are more difficult, so we can work up to those. But it will certainly help if you start adding context to things. So you tell them particular things that have happened and give the context, and tell them what your emotion was at the time. Not in those terms, of course, in normal terms. Sound like a normal person, not what I just said. But you can start helping them recognize emotions by recognizing, oh, that happened in that context, therefore that might be what I'm feeling. And it can be a good way of helping them to recognize emotions, which of course are all linked to their sensory reactions. And let's talk a little bit about the particular difficulties of secondary school and why that transition to secondary school is such a difficult point for a neurodivergent young person. They're going from a small school where they were in one classroom for most of the day with the same people that they might have known since year 1 or reception. Most of them they'll have known that long, with one teacher who they may or may not have liked, but that was the person that they went to if they had something wrong. Then in year 7, they are transported to this place that has loads of rooms and is really difficult to find your way around, and that's really scary and anxiety inducing, with loads of different teachers, some of whom they think are going to be very strict, with loads of different people, and they may not know any of them if they don't move up with friends, to having to move around the corridors of hell every hour and deal with bells going off all the time, to having to eat in a huge dinner hall with loads of other people making noise, it's smelly, all of those things and lots more besides, you know, new classes like science labs and things. All of those things equal uncertainty. Uncertainty equals anxiety. And so it's not surprising if during those periods of big transition and big overwhelm, sensory reactions ramp up. This is to be expected. It may mean that, for example, new school uniform is very difficult to wear. You know, I'm sure everyone here is aware that school uniform can be difficult. But of course, when you've just got that new set of school uniform, you probably have a novelty period, particularly if they're girls. You probably have a novelty period where, you know, it's really cool and exciting to wear that new school uniform, and they like to, you know, look at their shoes under the bed every night. I used to do that, and all of those things. But eventually the sensory sensations will kick in, and so those kind of things are what we think about when we think about secondary school. And then for parents, the biggest things that come up regarding sensory stuff in our Facebook group is school uniform. That's certainly one of them. How to get reasonable adjustments for school uniform, and eating. Eating is always a big issue, and you know, not eating, particularly when they're highly anxious. And again, that's the first thing to go when anxiety is really high. So unless they're actually ill, showing less appetite and not being able to decide what to eat is usually a sign of high anxiety. So I have finished now, as usual. And again, you will have seen this before if you've been in a talk with me. If you're neurotypical, I want you to think about different ways of doing the same thing, different ways that all of them are the right way. There's not one right way. And that's how we will start to understand more about neurodivergent people, who actually have come up with great many fantastic things. If you think about the tech leaders, a lot of them are neurodivergent. They think outside the box. It's different kind of thinking that we need. So we all need to be making compromises with each other. There is my book, available, well, anywhere really that you buy books. And if you would like to see some of the resources on our website, that is how to get to them. So I will stop talking now, and I'm happy to take any questions.